Dr. Moushumi Basu, Dr. Joy Ulaman, Dr. Jojama, Dr. Anil Kumar, and other dignitaries. Good evening and welcome. It is with great pleasure that we welcome you all to United Nations Day lecture. Dr. Moushumi Basu is our guest today. The topic of the lecture is United Nations and Governance in a Multipolar World. We all know that we are living in an era of globalization and interdependence, where United Nations and global governance have a big role to play. The COVID pandemic once again informed us that some of the existential threat to humanity can easily make state borders meaningless. Major problems of our time, like climate change, nuclear weapons, terrorism, migration, financial meltdown, etc., require international collective management. In other words, United Nations and global governance is not a choice, but a necessity for the very survival of this planet. It is true that large number of international institutions, laws, conventions, norms, etc. have evolved over the years, and it regulates the activities of state and other actors in international scene. However, we often feel that the impact of these institutions is not significant enough in many issue areas. Questions has also raised about the inclusiveness of these organizations. We can see that some of the big powers are lukewarm towards the international institutions recently. So what we are getting is a mixed picture about the United Nations as well as to global governance. We are happy that we have an eminent speaker to discuss these issues. Dr. Moushumi Basu teaches in the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is an expert in international organizations and issues of development, labor migration, and human rights. Before joining JNU, Dr. Basu was an assistant professor at the Institute for Social and Economic Change, Bangalore, and a visiting fellow at the School of Social Sciences and Cultural Studies, University of Sussex. A prolific writer, Dr. Basu published many articles in reputed journals and chapters. He also received Charles Wallace India Trust Research Fellowship in 2008. It is with immense respect I welcome Dr. Moushumi Basu to this program. Welcome, Madam. Dr. Jojama, Principal, Panambali Memorial Government College. Dr. Anil Kumar, Head, Department of Political Science are with us. Hearty welcome to both. Let me Joy Ulaman, Director General, Kerala Institute of Local Administration, Matthew Andrews, Assistant Director, and their team. Technical support to all our online program is provided by Kerala. A big thanks to them. Many faculty members, students, researchers are participating in this program. A warm welcome to all. Thank you, friends.
Okay, respected Chief Guest of the Day, Dr. Moushumi Basu from JNU, respected Director and our own friend and colleague, Dr. Dimpi Divakaran, and respected Head of the Department of Political Science, PG Department of Political Science, Panambali Government College, Dr. Anil Kumar, and a host of other faculty members and research scholars and students participating in this program. I take this opportunity to appreciate the PG Department of. Am I audible, sir?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I take this opportunity to congratulate the PG Department of Political Science of our college, headed by Dr. Anil Kumar, for having organized a seminar of this kind, a topic of contemporary relevance. Very serious topic to be discussed very detail on an appropriate day. And that too, not they conduct alone. They have also made an appropriate association with Institute of Parliamentary Affairs, Government of Kerala, and they have made an MOU also. And in the joint collaboration of the Institute of Parliamentary Affairs and the PG Department of Political Science of our college, have arranged a topic on a very important day, on a very contemporary topic. And I take this opportunity to appreciate the PG Department of Political Science, the whole faculties in the department, and especially the HOD, And I take this opportunity to thank my dear friend and director of the Institute of Parliamentary Affairs, Dr. Dimpi Divakaran, was also a faculty for college. And that was one of the golden days of the PG Department of Political Science in our college. And even now, many teachers and students remember with gratitude and pride the time that when Dimpi was HOD of the college, PG Department of Political Science, the kind of discipline, the kind of order, the kind of and the style of teaching that Dimpi has, everybody appreciate. And I thank Dimpi for having offered an association with the PMGC and a chance to have such a collaborative seminar on a topic of this kind. And they have arranged a very appropriate resource person who is well known across the globe and well known in India also, and known in Kerala also, a known researcher, a known talker, an orator on a topic of this kind. And the respected HOD of the political science is also a very good resource person who is all used to give his interview in media and all that. And they have arranged such a resourceful resource and appropriate experienced person who is having down to earth knowledge on the topic. And with these few words, I'm not spoiling much of your time. I thank all the participants, all the coordinators, PG Department of Political Science, and I am sharing a happy news that PG Department of Political Science of our college is driving towards to be upgraded as a research department within in a short while of time. Already they have submitted their application and the application is under processing. And definitely I'm sure that they will get it. And I appreciate all the efforts of this department and I welcome Moushumi Basu, respected resource, to this August program. And I thank Dimpi Divakaran Dimpi also. With these few words, let me stop. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Basu.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity for sharing my views on this very important subject today. My deepest appreciation to the organizers for keeping alive the culture of public lectures that is so crucial for engaging in college in collective knowledge production. I really, really appreciate this endeavor of reaching out to college students and bringing us together. My lecture today does not claim to provide anything new on the subject, but what I would be doing would be to organize the material around some central points that I see as being important for the subject. A little brief introduction about where I come from. I was trained in this discipline of international organization. I did my PhD in international organization, and now since 2006, I have been teaching various courses around on the subject of international organization. Now, the center where I teach, this is the only division in India where international organization is taught. So I'm very, very proud of the fact, but I also hope that by making this fact, visible and sharing this with you, there will come a time when there will be more international organization centers around India elsewhere. So as an international organization, the United Nations has a history that predates its formation in 1945, symbolizing the coming together of states at the international level to deliberate solutions to problems commonly faced. The process of international organization, of which the UN is an important representative, may be itself traced back to the heydays of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. The realization that an interdependent world gave rise to a number of common issues and problems that had to be dealt on a more permanent footing led to the establishment of many functional intergovernmental organizations from 19th century onwards, such as the International Telegraph Union, the Universal Postal Union, and paving the way for the formation of the first general purpose international organization, the League of Nations, at the end of the First World War. The UN that was formed in 1945 thus had a past. And it's this past that needs to be remembered if we are to assess in any way the role that the UN plays in governance in a multipolar world today. This is very important because what I see is students focusing a lot on the contemporary. So they are very, very excited about what is happening now. But history is something we should not forget. And the seeds that were sown in the past is what we are seeing now. And therefore, it's a plea that if one has to understand the United Nations, one has to be familiar with what happened in the past. So coming to the League of Nations that preceded the United Nations, it carried some of the foundational seeds of what the future world would look like. For example, following the practice laid out in the Congress of Vienna, the colonial powers saw it as their natural right to make decisions on behalf of others. So much so that after the end of this World War I, they had no qualms about taking indirect control of the mandate territories of the defeated powers and administering them on behalf of the League. If you read Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, it actually talks in a language that today we would find most despicable. It talks about people who are not able to stand up on their feet. So if you were to do a discourse analysis of that sort of language that was used, you would see that how the League of Nations, especially the entire mandate system, it sort of reflected the white man's burden. It spoke out about the civilizing mission that the West had vis-a-vis other countries. And that's why, if you look later on, it was these very same powers who consciously sought to introduce two parallel systems of governance to manage the multilateral order at the end of the Second World War. It's very interesting that in 1941, plans were afoot for designing international organization, which would replace the League of Nations. But at the same time, they were very clear. Those very powers who sat and designed the United Nations were also very clear that they wanted to keep United Nations out from the economic and financial field. So you find that the United Nations, with its principle of sovereign equality, one country, one vote, was placed. And this was in contrast to the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and World Bank, where the idea of weight voting was central. Now, if you look at the effects of that decision, and you see it today, you find that it actually has managed to ensure that the United Nations has remained more or less marginal to the governance of economic and financial relations at the global level. So that's why the past becomes very important for us. The fact that there was this political choice that was made in sort of setting out that how would the order be created at the end of the Second World War, whereby economic and financial affairs would be dealt by separately, by a separate set of institutions, and the UN would be in charge of other things. Now, it's interesting to see that as a result of that, in the Bretton Woods system, that's the set of institutions that I specialize on, we find that for a country, for a continent rather, of the size of Africa, which has about 54 countries in it, the voting size, because of the weight voting calculations, the voting share of these 54 countries works out to a total of 5.6% of the total vote share. So you can see that the African countries are the main clients of the Bretton Woods system, but they have no powers vis-a-vis decision making. And the interesting thing is that the United Nations doesn't have the financial wherewithal to actually fund programs in the economic and financial area. So this is one major point that I would really like to highlight, this compromise that, or this political choice that was executed at the end of the Second World War, and which has repercussions on how we deal with problems today. I would also like to remind you that the special privileges which were accorded to the permanent five in the UN Security Council that are well known to all, well, similar compromises were struck at the Bretton Woods Conference to ensure that the position of head of both these organizations, that is the president of the World Bank and the managing director of the IMF, would be open to citizens of select countries only. 77 years later, the arrangement still holds strong, with the president of the World Bank being an American citizen and the managing director of IMF and European. If one looks at the United Nations, especially the Security Council, the situation is not very different. Of the 193 members of the UN, there are approximately 63 states that have never been members of the Security Council. You know, those who are very good in maths can easily work out the percentage to see what percentage of UN membership have never sat on the Security Council table. Now, this constituency includes states like Afghanistan, Bhutan, Israel, Mongolia, among others. While for states like Israel, it may not be necessary for them to be personally seated at the table, with the United States of America being a strong ally, the same is perhaps not the case for other states. A knowledge of the past is therefore important for us if we are to understand the nuances of how governance works at the multilateral level. For in the real world, differences among states and population create hierarchies that make the landscape of international relations essentially rugged. International organizations become important in this context as they work to induce a sense of order into a world lacking the existence of a supranational entity drawing the allegiance of all states. With a nearly universal membership, the UN undoubtedly is an important actor, and it therefore becomes important for us to grasp the various facets that guide the multilateral process at the UN. Which brings me to the next point. How should one go about understanding the UN as an international body? Legally, membership of the UN is open to peace-loving states, qualifying it to be recognized as an intergovernmental organization. However, while membership is open to only states, the preamble of the Charter of the UN begins with the words, "We the peoples." And the fact that the UN has opened up to participation of civil society groups leads us to question whether it would be correct to identify the UN as a state-centric project alone. The classification provided by Thomas Wise of the three UNs is important in this regard. According to him, there is the UN of the political membership comprising 193 states, which he refers to as the first UN. The second UN comprises of the bureaucracy, while the third UN refers to civil society and other private actors and their interaction within the UN. A characterization such as this thus helps to move beyond the state-centric framework and pay attention to the work of other social actors involved in the UN processes. This is very, very important. Again, something which I would really like to stress, because as archives open up, it's becoming clear and it's becoming very interesting, you know, all this while. For example, when we looked at negotiation papers, when we looked at documents, you know, our training was such that we looked at states. Now, students can look and find out, oh, there were inputs which were received from civil society groups. There were inputs which were received from the UN bureaucrats themselves. And so it's a very interesting interplay that one can study. And to give you a very small example, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being negotiated, it was Hansa Mehta from India who suggested that, you know, the American revision and the reading that goes in their constitution, which reads that all men should be replaced by all humankind. So, you know, I hope in the future we are able to bridge this sort of gap which we have, where we can dig out more from the archives as to the contributions that were made by not just the bureaucrats, but also the civil society actors who were active in the past. Okay, so that's the other way. So please do not look at the UN just as a state-centric project, because there is an interplay which is happening all the time, which we need to take note of. Related to the above is another important point that I'd like to make: international organizations as bureaucracies. Now, this point necessitates us to pay attention to bureaucratic politics at play within the UN that influences different aspects of the governance process. Okay, as composite whole, it is not just 6 principal organs that are at work. So it's not just Security Council, General Assembly, Economic and Social Council, or the International Court of Justice, or the Trusteeship Council, or the Secretariat that we are looking at when we are studying the UN. But it is a number of also the family of specialized agencies that focus on different functional responsibility that collectively comprise the UN system. Now, you may focus on the principal organs, but you would be able to understand them better if you are to focus on the larger collective which comprises the UN system. Much like the way parliaments function, the UN too relies on an elaborate system of committees and subcommittees that manage the work that the UN does on a daily basis. Detailed notings of deliberations conducted in committee meetings as part of the official records of the organization help scholars to reconstruct the entire process from agenda making to the making of final decisions on any subject step by step. The UN archives provide an important base for those wanting to understand how the structures of governance work at the UN. However, legal and structural analysis per se is not enough to explain things. The larger political context within which the UN operates too needs to be kept in mind. This is something which, you know, I am provoked to constantly harp upon, because you would remember, I don't know, I hope teaching has changed, but the way the United Nations was first taught to me in school, it was like a civics textbook. It had the General Assembly has this part, these are the components, these are the things. The focus was just on structures. Why were those structures there? Who made them? What is their importance? How does it affect international politics? You know, can it be, is there a scope for change? You know, what happens to small states within this environment, within this political environment? These were aspects that were never really taught to us. You know, for studying the United Nations in a more holistic manner, of course, you need to be on top of the legal and structural points, but you cannot dismiss and you cannot be apolitical. Constantly keep in mind that the United Nations as an international organization is embedded in the international political system. Okay, the UN is a product of international politics. Many of you would know that the name United Nations itself was taken from the wartime coalition cry of the Allies. So, you know, and it was coined as representing the fight against the fascists. Okay, so there is a certain historical ring to it. So it was very much a product of international politics in the sense that the powers that were in the Allied powers, they sought to give themselves special responsibilities and special powers. Now, being a product of international politics, it is at the same time also receptive to changes in power configurations as member states are, you know, they themselves are receptive. The UN also is as receptive to the changes in power configurations globally. Having said that, however, it would not be wrong to say that there are situations where the UN does show signs of autonomous behavior that help reinforce the individuality of the organization as an actor autonomous in its own right. So here, you know, there is a choice which you can make. You can either take the realist position and treat the US as just being a tool in the hands of the big powers, or you can adopt certain more nuanced readings and try and identify areas where the UN shows signs of autonomous behavior. Okay, so scholars working in the constructivist tradition, like Martha Finnemore, have contributed to this discourse. Now to the issue of governance within the UN. At the UN, governance translates into many different types of functions that range from agenda setting, articulation and aggregation, socialization, dissemination of information, staffing and recruitment, execution of operations, and so on. The structure of governance varies across issue areas. In some cases, like humanitarian and peace operations, networks of agreement are set up with other organizations outside the UN to achieve the stated objectives. In today's lecture, I would, however, like to focus on some examples to illustrate how governance works at the UN by taking 3 specific examples from the field to show how the UN innovates through adaptation learning, and negotiations to exemplify the points that I want to make. Now, these are very important, concepts. Like all human societies, we learn how to adapt. I mean, the COVID has shown us that, while we never wore a mask, today we are forced to wear masks. So it's another sign of adaptation. Similarly, all human societies learn. So is the case that all human societies also learn how to negotiate with each other to settle issues that are important. So what I will do in this lecture is to highlight these three sort of areas and try and show you examples. I have tried to on the usual examples of the Security Council reforms, etc. I think there's a lot which is written on that. I want to focus on the lesser known examples, but which are nonetheless important. So let me begin by taking the issue of adaptation. Now, a very well-known example of adaptation is UN peacekeeping. Okay, you know that peacekeeping per se doesn't appear in the UN Charter. It was an innovation that was made because of the Cold War politics, and there were certain rules that were introduced which sought to keep the permanent five out of peacekeeping operations. And these rules actually served the international community well. These rules, which were innovated, sought to buy the confidence of the states where such peacekeeping operations were supposed to be headed for. So you find that in those rules, there were rules which were which spoke about the need for impartial troop contributions. That's why you find that none of the P5 countries were actually contributing troops during the Cold War. Similarly, the need for consent, where you could only deploy troops once you had a yes from the states where the conflict was going on. And the third issue about the third principle, that these troops would be lightly armed, and they would only use firepower in terms of self-defense. So peacekeeping is a very well-known example of how the UN learned how to adapt itself to a condition and sought to resurrect itself. And today, the moment you see blue helmets, you associate them with UN peacekeepers. But in today's lecture, I will choose to focus on a smaller, but what I consider is a very important example of adaptation. And because I'm giving this lecture to college students, I also thought I would introduce you to some of the nuances by which politics plays itself out within the UN. Now, this example focuses on the workings of one specific committee of the General Assembly. The General Assembly has 6 main committees that aid its working. So, the example that I've chosen deals specifically with the work of the 5th committee that looks after administrative and budgetary matters of the UN. Okay, this is a very inconspicuous example, but it's very interesting because it shows you in a very micro way the larger macro picture. Okay, so in the mid 1980s, this 5th committee, there was a crisis situation which kept coming up, where the big contributors, they would choose to cast a negative vote on budget resolutions in the General Assembly. Okay. And they would abstain first when the matter first came up for voting in the fifth committee. Okay. So at the fifth committee, they would abstain, but they would, when it would come up before the General Assembly, they would cast negative vote. Okay. Now, this created a problem for the General Assembly and the fifth committee in particular, because it was dealing with such an important matter of budget and expenses. Now, this spurred the General Assembly to establish the group of high-level intergovernmental experts to review the efficiency of administrative and financial functioning of the United Nations. So in August 1986, the group submitted 70 proposals to the Assembly, but there was no consensus in the group on streamlining the budget process. So the Assembly, on its own, it passed its resolution, which stated that the fifth committee must achieve the broadest possible agreement in passing the budget. Now, what was the significance of this? So, in a stroke, in one single stroke, what the Assembly did was that now it made it mandatory for the fifth committee to first build a consensus in the committee itself before bringing the proposals before the General Assembly. So with the necessity of finding a consensus or the broadest possible agreement, a very different mechanism of decision making, you were not looking for majority votes anymore. Rather, you were bringing and looking to bring each and every member state on board. Reaching this state of broadest possible agreement involved, therefore, many levels of consultation. And more importantly, this involved the use of carrot and sticks diplomacy to get member states to agree to the proposals, because this opened up the way for compromises, the way for negotiations, etc., within the fifth committee. Okay, so you had to get a yes from the fifth committee. Proposals would be watered down to suit the big contributors, and then it would be taken to the General Assembly, where it would then be ratified by them. So you can see that adaptation is one way, in one of the prisms through which we can understand how the UN works vis-a-vis governance issues. Okay. I'm not focusing on issues per se, but I'm trying to bring in these other aspects so that you're at ease to read up more about these. Similarly, if we take the issue of learning, here too there are very important examples. I mean, given that the UN has been around for so many years, I would like to focus on some of the path-breaking decisions taken by the UN, which reflect this process of organization learning. For example, my first example relates to the identification and subsequent recognition given to the category of internally displaced persons, IDPs, persons who are forced to move from one place to another on account of distress, but do not cross international borders, their incorporation within the larger refugee discourse. Those of you who would be interested in seeing how new categories are formed within existing discourses, please refer to the work of Francis Deng, who was the commissioner at that point in time, looking after refugees. And you can see how, as part of the UN bureaucracy, he pushed for the recognition of the problems of this particular category. So today, when we talk about refugees, you can see that the mandate of the UNHCR, it covers not only refugees, but it covers the issue of protection of IDPs too. Now, similar is the contribution made by the UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, in bringing to fore the importance of human development indicators in the larger discourse of well-being and development. Here too, if you go back to the 50s and the 60s, and then and you look at the indicators by which development was measured, it was infrastructure, it was economic growth. There were no people in that model. Okay, people started coming in. They came in through the basic needs sort of an approach. However, it didn't matter. It was only later when under Mahbubul Haq's thing that UNDP starts factoring in the indicators which relate to mortality, education levels, etc., to figure in this in the calculation of development. And we know today that all states in India, as well as outside India, adhere to the human development index. Okay, so this too I take as a very important example of organization learning concerning a redefinition of development, whereby which placed people's health, people's lives at the center of the development discourse. Now, a very good resource which all of you should look at is the Intellectual History Project, which was undertaken by the UN. Okay, and this is readily available on the internet. And this Intellectual History Project, it's done in themes, it's based on interviews with UN officials, with state functionaries, and it sort of records the cases of organization, learning, and adaptation across issue areas. So you have people-centric development, you have on peace, you have on economic issues of integration, globalization. So it's a very important and a rich source for understanding what the UN has sought to learn about its, learn from its experience on the field and in practice. Now, moving on to the issue of negotiations. Here again, I would like to place before you certain very important developments related to the discourse on violence that have emanated from within the UN. The discourse on gender-based sexual violence within the Security Council is a pertinent example of how states have come to acknowledge these acts of violence within the legal definition of war crimes. This is a very important development. In the Nuremberg trial, for example, after the Second World War, there were crimes against humanity, but there were crimes, nobody was persecuted for raping women, for other sorts of crimes that were committed. Today, thanks to the discourse on gender-based sexual violence, you do have rape being recognized as a definite war crime. Reports brought out by special rapporteurs employed by the Office of the Commissioner of Human Rights have been useful in documenting cases of sexual violence in times of conflict, which have created the base for countries to come out in accepting this reality. This has largely been facilitated by close working of UN experts with members of civil society groups. So I would urge students to visit the official page of the Office of the Commissioner of Human Rights and see for yourself the different thematic mandates that this office deals with. And with each thematic mandate, as you start identifying there is a legal commentary which accompanies each of these, which introduces you and which brings you up to date as to what does this actually mean. So if I'm looking at gender-based sexual violence, what does it mean? And it by looking at these, you can see that there are new grounds which are being opened as we speak within the UN on this. So the discourse is constantly evolving. Okay, you can check out the discourse on death penalty, abolition of capital punishment. Similarly, your discourse on various rights related to the social and economic. So whether you have, what does the right to healthcare mean? What does the right to education mean? There is a heading called general comments, which accompanies each of these rights and which provide an elaborate summary of what this right actually entails. So a very useful source for those who want to study this aspect of governance in detail. However, this is not to say that everything is rosy at the UN. Like I said, the UN is embedded in international politics, and we must not forget that. Okay, there are multi-layered challenges that confront us today, be it the issue of forests and the corporate takeover, or genocide, or the violence wreaked on particular communities, modern forms of slavery and labor exploitation, or denial of basic services needed to live a decent life. There is none that is less important than the other. In the quest for a better world, we need to strive hard, and while the UN may be physically far removed from us geographically, we as citizens can hope to knock on its doors virtually. In this myriad of multiple doors that exists in the time of globalization, the door of the UN definitely needs to be knocked upon so that more fresh ideas and thoughts can find new moorings. Ines Claude, a professor of international organization, in his book Swords into Plowshares, The Problems and Progress of International Organization, that's the title of his book, had this advice to give to students. He said students of international organization might do well to devote less energy to thinking about whether the United Nations is a suitable institution and more to considering what we can do with it or make of it. And that's where I'll end my lecture for today. And I look forward to the questions and the discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, madam. So it was very interesting lecture. I was trying to explain the evolution of the UN from 1940s to this period. She referred how decision making, how economic thinking, how negotiations has changed over the years. I think we can take the questions. Isn't it?
Sure.
We got 2 questions so far. Let me read them.
Okay.
One question is from Sri Kumar. He is asking, do you think that the amendment of UN Charter will give an adequate space to economically developing countries in the changed circumstances?
Okay. Do you want me to answer simultaneously?
We can take one more question.
Okay, sure.
This is a question from Budira, very common question. How do you think about India in UN Security Council?
Okay. So let me start with the first one about the amendment. Okay. as students of international organization, amendment is a procedure that is quite complicated. Okay, now, but so the very process of amendment, what will you amend, etc. And this brings me to the larger question of reforms also. Okay, what I want you to understand is that there is a non-negotiable core which is there at the center of the international architecture. And that non-negotiable core is that while the UN can, with its multiple, 193 members, they can all be a member of the UN body, but when it comes to issues of development, etc., substantive decisions will be undertaken at a forum, which is the Bretton Woods institutions. I mean, you can, if you study the Bretton Woods institutions, you can see how and why through the structural adjustment programs that were introduced in the 80s, globalization was actually made easier. Okay, so even if there is an amendment to the UN provisions, you are not giving the UN financial powers to make substantive changes. Okay, the UN from its UN budget can give grants. That's the only thing the UN can. The UN supports technical assistance programs, but that's the only thing. Whenever you have problems, it is the Bretton Woods institutions that you have to go to. And this is the problem. Okay, so amendments per se is not going to solve or make the arrangement more democratic. And which brings me to the other question regarding India's participation in the Security Council. I mentioned this deliberately because 63 other states have never sat on the Security Council. Now, India has sat several times along with Pakistan, and one of our students in CPOD did an interesting study where they found that when India and Pakistan sat jointly at the Security Council, they actually voted there was a similar pattern which one could see in terms of their voting statistics. Okay, but the question is that India, by becoming a member of the Security Council, is it going to make a radical change in the way the architecture is organized? No. So if it has 15 members, there will be just one more addition or two more additions, and that will not make the arrangement more democratic. So I'm sorry, but I think we need to think more about why we want the Security Council to change and what parts of the UN architecture are negotiable for change. That is the other important question. Yeah? Does that answer?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. There are some questions coming up in the chat box.
Yes. Yes, madam. May I read some of them?
Yes. Yes.
One question is, considering the current international scenario, why do you think the UN has gone silent? The questionnaire assumes that you said that UN has gone silent.
Yes.
Another question is how multipolarity affect the functions of the United Nations.
Okay. Okay. So yes, the UN has gotten silent on the Rohingya issue. Why is it that time and again And this is something which maybe our own, we as citizens have to think, we have a lot of our students, they work on conflicts in Africa, Middle East, etc. But they do not know what's happening in their own country, right? Similarly, on the Rohingya issue, it's very sad and ironical that Myanmar has got away with what it has done to the Rohingya population in the Rakhine area. Okay. Similarly, let's look at the issue of forest fires. There are forest fires happening every year. Okay. There is a UN forum on forests, but it has no teeth. Why? Because it can only recommend. There was not a single statement which it made about monoculture. There was no statements made about the corporate takeover of forest lands, etc. Now, this sort of a dysfunctionality is what will hurt UN. So yes, there are areas in which it has completely gone silent. And it is for us to ask those questions. Why has it got silent on those issues? Because these issues are as important as other issues. Okay. And what drives agenda making at the UN? Who will put what issues? It's important for us to know that. That was one, the silent. And the second question, I'm sorry, was multipolarity. Yeah. So, we always look for a class which is diverse. Okay, where diverse views, diverse, same, I think, is the case for the UN. If it wants to truly represent the international community, it must appreciate diversity. And when I say appreciate, it must not be a superficial appreciation. It must be more internalized. Okay. So, for example, you look at heritage protection. Okay. It's very interesting. These are all new fields which are important. Now, why is it that heritage monuments get destroyed and there is silence from the UN? Okay, or for that matter, when big states are fighting a conflict and a lot of resources are being wasted, but the UN is driven to not really take those on board. So multipolarity becomes important simply because that is how the world is organized. And the world is organized not in a homogeneous manner. So while we welcome universality, universality doesn't mean that everything has to be homogeneous. Universality should embrace diversity, which means there should be a diversity of views which can be clearly articulated. Okay, so that's why multipolarity is so important.
One question is about International Court of Justice. The question is whether the International Court of Justice is a superfluous or redundant institution, as there has been many instances where countries, including US, Russia, not enforcing decision. That's one question. Another question is about related to COVID. Certain countries are taking steps to give booster vaccines to everyone. At the same time, there are people who haven't got one dose of vaccine yet. In this context, in what way would you think that UN could intervene, ensuring social equality?
let me start with the second question, which is to do with COVID. Here again, you're asking the wrong type of question. The UN can't ensure equality. Okay, the UN can't ensure equality simply because the UN does not have the resources. The international community has made this a choice, and because we're living in this age of neoliberal global order, we should be aware that the manufacturing of vaccines, the trade aspects, these are all in the hands of the private players. Okay, in India, public sector health units have been disinvested. So you look around the world. It is only from the private companies that it is coming over. The UN has no control over the private companies, right? This is at the core of the problem that we are facing. We've made a choice whereby we are allowing the private companies to have a run. For example, COVID has increased the fortune of certain individuals across the globe that most of you know, whether it's Amazon, whether it's other service. The fortunes of these companies have benefited because of COVID. At the same time, livelihoods have been lost. So there's a very interesting report done from the labor perspective, which is looking at wage thefts, okay, which is looking at how much money was lost by workers during the COVID because of the fact that they lost their jobs or they were not paid, etc., etc. So on the issue of vaccines, it's very important to look at what the WHO mandate is and what it can do vis-a-vis other private players on the field. To give you a very small thing, there's a interesting WHO thing on framework on tobacco control. And if you look at it, it took 20 years for the WHO to come up with this framework, simply because who was resisting? It was the tobacco companies. And they protested because earlier you would only have one single line on cigarette packets which said that this is harmful for health. But over time, WHO said, no, they should be increased. There should be a visual representation. And so the fight was over exactly that, no, this is not proven that smoking causes cancer. So the whole issue was turned around into an issue of science. The same goes with GM crops. Okay, so there are some issues on which you have to understand that the UN just can't do much because the way the system is organized. Okay, that's one. Dr. Divakaran, I forgot the other question while I was answering this. I'm sorry.
That is about International Court of Justice. International Court of Justice.
Oh, yes, International Court of Justice. So, the International Court of Justice, there was a permanent court of international justice during the League years, and then you had the International Court of Justice. Now, the International Court of Justice, again, has 15 judges sitting there. It has legal representations from certain countries, etc. Now, what is it that the ICJ does? How does it benefit us as citizens? So it's the ICJ comes into play only when states, I mean, you and me can't take a case to ICJ, right? So it's only states who take cases. But in that limited sphere, what is interesting is some of the opinions and the court judgments that come out of the ICJ. For example, the fact that the wall which Israel built, ICJ ruled that it was illegal, or the ICJ advisory opinion on nuclear weapons, etc. Now, these are all court judgments which can be very, very useful for us as citizens. Okay, because, but of course, the ICJ, you can have countries not adhering to the norms. You can have, and this is not peculiar to just ICJ. In the WTO, the same thing happens. The WTO has a dispute settlement mechanism, and many of the cases get settled outside. Many of the cases remain lingering till the complainants withdraw. So these are part and parcel of how international politics happens. Okay, this is something which we we can only hope to name and shame countries who don't adhere to these rules, right? That's my opinion.
We can take a couple of questions.
Okay.
Isn't it? Right?
Yeah. Okay.
One question is about non-state actors in international relations. The question is how they are affecting the negotiations, whether their participation has strengthened or diluted the negotiation in decision making. Okay. Another question is about democracy. Democracy is universally recognized ideal and is one of the core values of the UN. But isn't it UN actually undermining the ideal of democracy by creating a hierarchy within the system?
Yes. So let me answer again the democracy bit. UN actually has a whole program on democracy promotion. And what is interesting is that we have to ask this question: what does democracy actually mean? There is a procedural side to it. There is a substantive side to it. Is our holding of elections the only sign of democracy, or there is a larger democratic ethos that democracy actually reflects? Okay, so unfortunately, this democracy promotion which the UN engages in, if you critically look at it, it is very much like the white man's burden, teaching other states, teaching the so-called non-democratic states to become more civilized. And so therefore there is a certain problem with that sort of an approach, because democracy has to come from within. You cannot have countries determining that they don't like the regime of a particular country, so they will invade and they will get rid of the ruler. No, democracy doesn't function like this. So even where the UN seeks to help states build democracy, it needs to be critically examined whether what are the parameters that it's using to define democracy. Okay, democracy for us has to be, in order to be meaningful, has to have substantive elements in it. Democracy has to be accompanied with freedom and the question of rights recognition. Okay, so that is one. So the world of non-state actors is very diverse. Okay, you have non-governmental organizations, you have corporations, you have movements. Okay, so it's a very diverse field. Then you have, of course, private militia groups, drug cartels. These are all non-state actors. Okay, now, if you look at the history of colonialism, who led it? It was European merchant companies, shipping companies. Okay, nothing much has changed now also. If you look now, you have corporates who are ensuring that rules are put in which through which the way the rules are phrased, that they get their benefits are looked after. So there are interesting issues when it comes to the non-state actor category. So there are civil society groups working across a range of issue areas. Again, within civil society groups, there's a vast diversity. So for example, if you were to look at agriculture, there would be organized groups, but there would also be movements, right? Like farmers' movement. Now, who does the UN listen to? Okay, who does the UN reach out to? And here I would put the responsibility on the UN. Who is it reaching out to? Is it reaching out only to the organized non-state actor, or is it reaching out to the peasants and farmers who are part of movements? Okay, so and this is becoming increasingly a very important question, because when it comes to negotiations, who is being represented becomes important. Okay, in whose names are these policies being made becomes important. Okay, that's why the whole category of non-state actors is something which you require to be very clear what actor you're talking about. Okay, yeah.
Okay, madam, it was a very nice time. We gone through various issues related to UN and global governments, but it's time to wind up, even though there are some more questions. Now I invite Dr. Anil Kumar to say what of thanks.
Thank you, Dimpi sir and Moushumi madam. So actually, we are talking about UN and its governance in a multipolar world. And Moushumi madam started from the beginning, reminding us that this international institution is working from different systemic pressures from the international politics. But she attempted and give a new orientation to when we are addressing and discussing about UN and governance in a multipolar world. You should think about the way how they are starting and how they are learning and how they are doing negotiations by taking examples on UN peacekeeping operations and then UN decision-making process on the matters of internally displaced people, and then you are reminding us by citing example from discourses which is happening about gender within the framework of UN law making in Security Council, etc. So anyway, it is very interesting lecture because I believe that there are many things which are unaddressed in the multipolar world by UN, but UN and its governance is concerned. But the benefit of this lecture is that within this short span of time, she gave a very perfect orientation to students in a highly non-traditional way, because he is telling that when we in a multipolar world, the power is so much diffused, and when you are addressing these kinds of governance, there are existence of international law, there are existence of domestic law. At the same time, there are institutions like International Court of Justice. So many corporates, non-state actors, non-governmental institutions. So how beautifully she narrated all these things, and how to many of our students. We are very happy. So I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Moushumi Basu from JNU, New Delhi, for delivering the lecture on UN and the governance in the multipolar world. Thank you, madam, very much.
Thank you.
I take this opportunity to thank to Director of Institute of Parliamentary Affairs, Government of Kerala, Dr. Dimpi Divakaran, He is a close associate me from our Maharaja's days, and then he moved to our college, Panambali College, as head of the Department of Political Science. Now he is actually directing the Institute of Parliamentary Affairs, Government of Kerala. But one thing is very sure, that always he is addressing, making programs from different aspects, and he's organizing programs at different levels. Sometimes he's organizing programs for civil society, sometimes it is for politicians, sometimes for students. Anyway, whenever he's organizing program, we can team of participants from different parts of the country. This time too, we can see different participants from different parts of the country, from Uttar Pradesh, from Punjab, from Haryana, from Tamil Nadu. Many participants were there in this program also. So I thank personally my friend Dr. Dimpi Divakaran for organizing this program, even in the context of different challenges we are facing. And this is a way we can only organize program nowadays. We are kind enough to extend our heartfelt thanks to Dr. Dimpi Divakaran for this program. And I'm again thanking for Joy Lemon sir from Kila. He offered, actually he helped Institute of Parliamentary Affairs for digitally organizing this platform, because we can we can give opportunities for many people who offered that platform, and they were also participating in the program. So in the name of Department of Political Science, Panambali College, and in the name of Institute of Parliamentary Affairs, we are extending heartfelt thanks to you, sir. Again, our principal of Panambali College, Dr. Jojaman, he is amazing and inspiration for us, because our college is placing in a very remote area. And we can see that many of the students are from rural areas, but still we are organizing the program. Then the students are expressing their different kinds of concern when we are organizing program, that madam is from Jawaharlal Nehru University, can we ask questions how she will take, whether she will be offended. But I told the students that this is the way you can meet people from different parts of the country, and this is the way you can grow. So I believe that this is a great opportunity. And last, I'm helping, so I'm extending my vote of thanks to all the staff which is working behind this from Institute of Parliamentary Affairs. And thank you once again. Thank you all. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, madam. Madam. We'll meet again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.